and Twitter. Tonight we are very honored and very appreciative to have with us Joe Ivester and the Outskirts of Hope. In 1967, when Joe Ivester was 10 years old, her father transplanted her young family from a suburb of Boston to a small town in the heart of the Mississippi cotton fields, where he became the medical director of a clinic that served the poor population for miles around. But ultimately, it was not Ivester's father, but her mother, a stay-at-home mother of four who became a high school English teacher when the family moved to the South, who made the most enduring mark on the town. In The Outskirts of Hope, Ivester uses journals left by her mother as well as writings of her own to paint a vivid, moving, and inspiring portrait of her family's experiences living and working in an all-black town during the height of the civil rights movement. Jo Ivester spent 2 years of her childhood living in a trailer in Mound Bayou, where she was the only white student at her junior high. She finished high school in Florida before attending Reed, MIT, and Stanford in preparation for a career in transportation and manufacturing before she became a teacher. This book is getting rave reviews. Among them is something from Kirkus Book Review that says, "What makes this book particularly valuable is its vivid depiction of the abhorrent consequences of legalized segregation. What gives it its heart is the window it opens to the personal journeys of a mother and daughter, and importantly, riveting history lesson that unfortunately is still relevant today." Please give your warmest books and books welcome to Mrs. Jo Ivester.
Thanks, Mitch. Excuse me. Yeah. Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Books and Books is an incredible bookstore, as you all know. I feel very honored to be here this evening. I did want to point out a couple of folks who are with us tonight, that it's very special to me to have them here. My cousin Toby, who I grew up idolizing, and she's just been wonderfully supportive throughout my efforts writing this book, and really made it possible for me to be here tonight. Charlie, who has done all the outreach in Miami to let folks know about the book. You might have seen some coverage in the newspaper recently, and I'm so appreciative. My husband, John, who has been traveling around the country with me, and he calls himself my roadie. So that's been a different role, but it's been a lot of fun having him traveling with me. And some very special guests here tonight. In the back row, Sabrina and Rafi, and they were my mother's students, not in Mississippi, but here in Miami. So we lived here, as Steve said, for several years, and my mother taught in Liberty City at Allapattah Junior High, and they were her students there. And a few years back, when they were having a 40th reunion of their 9th grade class, they found me online and sent me a note saying, could my mother come to their reunion? And I wrote back and said, she's really not able to travel anymore without me, but if you don't mind me coming, I'll bring her. And I did. We came back to Miami. We joined them for an incredible reunion. We've stayed in touch ever since. And when we celebrated my mother's 90th birthday party, Sabrina came to Texas to join us. So just a wonderful connection, and thank you so much for coming tonight. So you've already heard a little bit about the story, about the book. I want to, before I get into sharing some readings, tell you a little bit more about my mother, because the book really is about her. I've tried to channel her in my writing, and it's based on some journals that she wrote. So it's as much as possible trying to copy her voice from the journals, with my own voice as a 10-year-old child kind of intermingled around there. But you have to picture my mother. The first thing, I look big next to her. So she was, at her height, at her tallest, she was 4'10". By the end, and she passed about 2 years ago, but she was down to 4'6" and 70 pounds. I could have carried her. She was that petite. And she was so brave and so energetic and such a wonderful, wonderful teacher. So I want you to picture her. But she didn't start out as a teacher. She started out primarily as a homemaker. She was our mother of 4 kids, and she helped my dad in his pediatric practice. She helped her father in his restaurant business. And she had grown up with the idea that her job was to learn as much as she could about literature, history, culture, to make herself as strong a woman as possible, not because of who she was, but so that she could be a platform for her husband and children from which they could fly. And that's how she viewed herself. She was their platform, our platform. When we moved to Mississippi, she was recruited to start teaching. And the book is really her coming of age story, because once she started teaching, she realized she didn't need to be someone else's platform. She was a dynamic, intelligent, powerful, important woman in her own right. So the book is her coming of age story. And as I started working on it, I realized it was my coming of age story too. So that's what I'll share with you tonight. Before I get into a little bit of reading, I want to share a 30-second clip. Do we have that lined up? And this is from one of my mother's students. It's very brief, 30 seconds, but to give you her perspective about my mother. Well, can we do one now and one in a little bit?
What year would this have been?
So, well, the clip is very recent, in the last year, but this was a student of hers in the late 60s.
In Mississippi?
No, here in Allapattah Junior High. So thanks for letting me clarify that.
You got an image, but there's...
Yeah, I'm going to get the other
Red
one. I
light.
just want to make sure I get this. Oh, I'll do that one.
Hi, my favorite memory of Miss Kruger is learning Christmas carols phonetically. She assigned me "O Come All Ye Faithful" in Latin, and because of that, that became my favorite Christmas carol. Adeste fideles, laete triumphantes, venite,
Doesn't do the whole thing.
venite in Bethlehem. Since I'm only limited to 45 seconds, I can't sing the whole song. But she was the greatest teacher ever. The first day of class, she stood on the desk and she took control. Thank you.
So I want to start, I guess I'll wait for the lights to come on, with a brief explanation of the where I got the title. So it's called The Outskirts of Hope, and that wasn't my phrase. I stole it from President Johnson, and some of you might recognize that. And in 1964, he said, "Many Americans live on the outskirts of hope, some because of their poverty, and some because of their color, and all too many because of both. Our task is to help replace their despair with opportunity." Well, my parents absolutely believed that, and that's what I grew up on, was that it was our job to help people. And just a quick background story about the phrase, "the outskirts of hope." It was very natural for me to use that phrase because I grew up with it, because it was our philosophy. And about 2 months ago now, I got a note, email from my cousin who said, you do know that my father probably wrote that phrase. And my cousin has a wonderful sense of humor, so I wrote back and said, "Are you joking? What are you trying to tell me? Is there something here?" And he said, "Well, yeah, I thought you knew. He was the communications director for President Johnson's War on Poverty, and he was a speechwriter." Well, presidential speechwriters don't get credit for what they write, because we're supposed to believe the presidents write everything they say. But it turns out that this phrase that I picked for my title may well have been penned by my uncle. So that just feels like such wonderful synchronicity and serendipity. We'll never know if it's true or not. I like to think that it is, and that my cousin recognized his father's style of writing. So that's the little story behind the title of the book. What I want to do now is share with you what happened when my mother first went to Mississippi. So to set the stage for this, my father came home from work one day and sitting around the table with the kids at lunch, and he says, if you could live anywhere in the country, where would it be? Where would you like to go? We played games like this all the time. So I'd been reading a novel about that took place in Arizona. So I was picturing horseback riding and mountains, and I said, let's move to Arizona. And one brother said, let's go to Hawaii. He loved the beach. We'd never been to Hawaii. He had this wonderful romantic notion. And my mother said Puerto Rico. They had gone there for her 25th anniversary. So she had wonderful memories there. My father goes, you're all wrong. We're moving to Mississippi. And that was how we found out. And about 3 weeks later, he started commuting right away, and he brought my mother with him to Mississippi so she could see what it was going to be like. And from her journals, I was able to, and interviewing her, I spent a couple thousand hours interviewing my mom, which was an incredible experience. But here's in her voice what it was like. As we drove south on Highway 61 toward the Mississippi state line, the road curved through pine forests, almost as lovely as those I'd grown up with in New England, and the gently rolling terrain reminded me of the hills outside of Boston. This won't be so bad, I told myself as I looked out the car window at the lush landscape. Mound Bayou, where we were heading, was the oldest all-black town in the country. It would be the site of Leon's new clinic, which would serve the black population of Bolivar County. My husband, with such a big responsibility and so willing to help others. While I loved that in him, his decision meant that after spending most of my 44 years in the Boston area, I now had to say goodbye to the life I loved. Its theater and dinner parties, summers at the beach, and outstanding schools for my 3 young children. We would be one of only 2 white families among the 1,300 people of Mound Bayou, and our presence alone would throw us into the heart of the civil rights movement. At the Mississippi border, a billboard greeted us with a picture of a breathtaking antebellum mansion surrounded by magnolia trees. It said, "Welcome to Mississippi, the Magnolia State." Moments later, the road transitioned from a well-maintained highway to a bumpy 2-lane blacktop. Then we rounded a curve and the trees disappeared. The road straightened and the hills vanished. As far as the eye could see, there was nothing but mud. So she started seeing the poverty of Mississippi, the endless fields, and her mood started sinking as she realized this was going to be our home. And there's kind of no non-awkward way to say this, but my mother had a nervous bladder, and the more concerned she got and depressed she got, the more she felt a need to find a restroom. And this is what happened next. I had begun to think that squatting by the side of the road where everyone could see would be preferable to waiting any longer when we finally spotted what looked to be an abandoned gas station. It was completely deserted. No other cars, no staff. Please, please let it be unlocked and let there be a bathroom, I said to myself. Moments later, I sighed with relief as Leon stopped in front of the dilapidated building and I saw a sign that read, "Women." I was halfway to the bathroom before I noticed a second sign that said, "Whites only." Desperate to go inside, I chose not to worry about it and was instead silently grateful that I wasn't black. Once I was inside with the door shut behind me, it smelled so bad that I had to hold my breath. My shoes stuck to the floor as I stepped in dried urine. The seat was so disgusting that I didn't sit, but instead stood over it, growing angrier and angrier at the entire situation. How could Leon expect me to move to this awful place? By the time I was finished, I was so mad that I took the soiled Kleenex I'd used from my purse and I threw it on the floor. I couldn't tell the others what I had done. I was already embarrassed by my childish behavior. But I did tell them how revolting this whites-only restroom had been. The sad thing, John said, one of their traveling companions, is that it'll be a black person who has to clean it. A wave of guilt washed over me as I thought of the dirty tissue I'd left on the floor. For the next hour, I stared out the window, my head beginning to ache as images raced through my mind. Mississippi, shacks, filthy restrooms, mud, more mud. No one told my mother how to behave or what to expect. It didn't occur to her that using a whites-only restroom was kind of an ultimate sin, that this was really inappropriate behavior for a family about to move to an all-black town to support the black community. Well, my father was equally naive, so he told people what had happened, and word went out in the town, and my mother felt ostracized and hated. People said to her, "Don't move here. We don't need someone like you." And she just felt awful. She wouldn't forgive herself, and she felt like no one would forgive her. Well, what turned things around is a few weeks after we moved there, she got recruited to teach. And she turned out to be a natural, though at first she did have difficulties, as every new teacher does. And she loved the students from day one. I've interviewed many of her former students, and I was trying to get specific anecdotes, and I was successful with that, and a lot of them are in the book. But a lot of the folks I talked to, they couldn't remember anything specific. What they said was she cared. She was an adult figure in their lives who they felt they could totally trust and who cared what happened to them and expected them to be able to succeed. And that meant the world. So she was successful fairly quickly, but one of the first problems she had was she couldn't understand her students. So the dialect in Mound Bayou was pretty strong, the southern black dialect. And the folks that lived in the town we could understand pretty easily, but the students that came from what we called out in the rural or out on the plantations, they sometimes spoke in a way that I can remember constantly saying, "Wait, what did you say?" And having had them repeat over and over. Well, you saw in the video a mention of phonetics. My mother said, "I know what to do." She had been trained in speech, English, and drama at Emerson College. And she said, "I'm going to use the phonetic alphabet, and I'm going to teach my students to speak in a way that I can understand them." Well, since that time, there's been a lot of focus on whether this is an appropriate teaching technique or not, with the idea being that if you say to a student, "You got to change the way you're speaking," are you going to hurt their self-image? And my mother was just practical. She said, "You guys talk." She wouldn't say "you guys," that's me. She was very, very proper. But you talk about wanting to go north, which was a big deal for everybody in the town, for all the teenagers. You want to go north and get jobs. Well, if you can speak the way mainstream America, i.e. white America, can speak, you will improve your chances of getting a job. It's not fair, but it's reality. And with that, she started teaching them the phonetic alphabet. And this is a passage that goes over what one of her classrooms was like. Having noticed that most of the black people I'd met over the last few weeks pronounced the word ask as ax, I decided to start there. "Let's begin with the word ask," I said. Glancing at my seating chart, I called on a girl who looked a little bit sleepy. "Naomi, I want you to repeat a word for me." She pointed at herself as if to say, "What, me?" And I nodded. "Please say the word ask." "Ax." I looked around the room. Can anyone hear the difference between what Naomi said and what I said? My heart pounded in my chest as I wondered if I'd ever be able to get the students to respond. Ask, ax. Look at how they're spelled using phonetics. She wrote it on the board. See how my mouth moves differently with the two words. They stared at me, but I didn't see any glimmer of interest. No heads nodding, no sign that they understood. I sighed internally, frantically trying to figure out how to capture their imagination. Let's try something different. I want everyone to hiss like a snake. Don't be shy with me. Sss. Well, a few started to hiss. Well, that's it, but I need everyone to join in. Let's make the students in the next classroom think we've just released a whole nest of snakes. Sss, they all hissed, laughing at themselves. Well, great. Now that's the sound in the middle of the word, ask. But the next step is to put the sound ah before the hiss. A boy in the back of the room experimented softly. Ass. Then he let out a guffaw, joined quickly by the other boys sitting around him. As I walked toward their desks, they were suddenly quiet, their eyes growing large, fearful that I'd be mad at their disrespect. Instead, I said, "Congratulations, gentlemen, you've figured it out." I could feel the whole class relax. Then I walked back to the front of the room and wrote ass on the blackboard. Now let's all say it together, ass. And they did. And that was what my mother was like in the classroom. She found a way to connect. With that, Steve, can we show the second clip? It's another very brief 30-second one. And you may recognize the individual speaking. Can we get the volume up?
Not only taught her junior high school students English, but she also taught them that it was okay, that it was right to speak up against injustices. A woman only 4 feet 8, diminutive and shorter than most of her ninth grade students, yet tall in her beliefs and more than willing to open her students' minds and not allow them to be unchallenged in their thinking. Ultimately learning to speak up about what they felt was not right. Aura Kruger, a teacher who planted seeds, and today they have grown and grown and grown, and we will be forever grateful for her.
Thanks. One of the favorite interactions when we came for the reunion, one of the men who at the time was already, I think, in his 50s, maybe his late 40s, but he said, "I didn't know it was an English class. I thought it was a class about life." And another former student said that what he learned in her classroom gave him the strength to resist being pulled in by the gangs. So I'm so proud of my mother. Well, through her work in the classroom, her introduction to town where she'd use the whites-only restroom, that just disappeared. And people forgave her for it and accepted her. They accepted us, which was really wonderful. And we'd been there, I guess, about 8 months. And something happened which showed how much we'd been accepted in town. It was April of 1968, and Martin Luther King was assassinated. And we were right there in Mississippi, and just heartbreaking. He was the hero to everybody in town. He was actually scheduled to come to town. He'd been in Memphis for the garbage collectors strike. And the next stop on his speaking engagements was going to be Mound Bayou, and everybody was excited about that when we got word. Well, the way my family got word was the phone started ringing at about 5 in the morning, and friends, colleagues, family were calling saying there's rioting all over the country. They knew we didn't have TV, so they knew we were not quite up on the day-to-day news. There's rioting everywhere. It is dangerous for you to be in town. You're the only white people there. You will be a target. Either get out of town or lock up your trailers and just stay there. And we didn't do that. My parents went to work, my brothers went to school, I went to school, and I am so glad that we did, because we were welcomed into the town's grieving. I can remember going up to friends, 10 years old at this point, and we didn't necessarily have to say anything. We would just look at each other and get choked up and hug. And my brother's experience, my parents' experience was the same thing. So instead of being targets and being hated for being white, we were embraced by the town. And I still get choked up when I think about that. It was a horrible, horrible thing that happened, but in some ways, the memories of how we were welcomed into the shared grieving are what I remember. A week after that, the students did want to reach out and say something to the white community. And there weren't any white people in our town other than us. And so they got together with students in the next town, which had a white part of town and a black part of town. And they said, let's do something that Dr. King would have wanted us to do. Let's have a peaceful march. And they organized it. And my older brother helped organize it. And my mother said, I'm going to be a part of this too. So they went to the next town with several hundred students. And this was the experience that they had there. The signal came, and we began to walk slowly down the street, the sun already high in the sky and beating down on us. I looked into the street and noticed that a police car stayed right beside my partner and me, the officer in the passenger seat pointing his rifle at my partner the entire time. So they had paired off at the police request or demand, so they're walking 2 by 2. And a young man had, when they realized this was what they were going to do, he had come up to my mother and asked if he could be her walking partner. And then he carefully placed himself between her and the police cars. 9 police cars had shown up, each with a rifle pointing out the window, and several of them with police dogs. And for any of you who have seen the movie Selma recently, or that remember the film footage from back in the 60s, they were very afraid of what might happen. So this young man was, to me, a real hero for having stood next to my mother. As we started to walk down the street, people on the porches began singing hymns. A singing elderly person occupied every rocking chair as we marched by. They waved to us, cheered us on with their voices raised in songs. Many cried. I became so accustomed to the presence of our well-wishers that it struck me as odd whenever I saw an empty porch. What a change a few minutes later when we marched into the white section of town. It was a different world. Instead of dirt roads, there were paved streets lined with well-kept sidewalks. Rather than tiny wooden shacks, handsome brick and stone homes with manicured lawns stood along the streets. Instead of the warmth of voices raised in song, there was absolute quiet. Not a soul in sight, for residents had locked up their homes as tightly as possible. Drapes were drawn shut, streets were deserted, the silence relentless. We marched for close to 2 hours, crisscrossing the town until we'd walked down every block. Finally, we stopped in front of City Hall, and one of the ministers stepped to the front of the line. In a deep, booming voice, he said, "Let us pray." Resuming our march, we returned to the black section of town where we stood in front of one of the churches, a small wooden structure with peeling paint. The students wandered off, but the adults gathered on the church steps, talking over the events of the day. Suddenly, over the chattering, I heard a deep baritone quietly singing, "We shall overcome." And one by one, the rest of us joined in. So that was a pretty amazing experience. I hadn't been allowed to go be part of the march in the next town over because I was too young, not yet 11. But after the march, everyone came back to our town, including all the students from the next town over. And we stood in a big empty field, and for the next few hours, we sang songs, we heard speakers, there was prayer. It was a life-changing moment as I saw this town come together. So when my father said we're going to move to Mississippi because it's important work, he was absolutely right, that it was a really good thing that we were doing. But there was a price to pay. So my oldest brother, who was 13 when we moved there, he got involved in the civil rights movement, this march being just one of many examples, and he attracted the attention of the KKK. And we'll never know if this is true or not, but my parents were told that there was a price on his head. And as soon as they found out about that, they shipped him out of town. and he came back to the north, to Massachusetts, and lived with my 19-year-old sister. So the family got broken up. The brother, who was 11 when we moved, was a bit of a loner, and he never made friends. I asked him recently if he'd stayed in touch with any of his friends from there, and he said, I had no friends. So he left his circle in Newton, Massachusetts, and didn't really have a social life once we got to Mound Bayou. I had it easier. I was very outgoing. I was a tomboy. I fit right in. Within days of our arrival, I found a group of boys that were playing football, and I said, hey, can I play? And they kind of looked at me like, you know, I was white, and more than that, I was a girl, and I wanted to play football, and they kind of shrugged and said okay, and when they realized I could play and could catch the ball and run with them, I became part of the gang. So I had a great group of friends. So that happened very quickly. I loved playing football with them. And then we got to the first football game, the high school football game. So in Texas, where we live now, football is huge at the high school, Friday night lights and all that. Mississippi, it was big. It was the big social event of the week in the fall. And this little tiny town that had only 1,300 people living in it would have a traffic jam because all these pickups were coming in from 30, 40 miles away for this big celebration. And here's what happened that first football game. I'm going to read something in my own voice, so you'll hear me as a 10-year-old child. But before I do, I want to set the stage a little bit. At this point, I've kind of backtracked a little, and my mother was still feeling a little bit left out and not liked. And the football game was a huge deal to her because the woman she sat next to in the stands kept saying over and over again the whole evening, we are so glad you're here. And you and your husband are doing a great thing by bringing your family here and helping us. So my mother was being buoyed up and was really appreciating that. And when I looked at her journal and shared with her writing, it was all very, very positive stuff about that evening. Well, I eventually shared with her what had happened to me that evening, which was quite different. I got pretty bored soon after the kickoff. I liked playing football, but it turns out that watching it is kind of dull. So I climbed down to look for my friends. I found some older boys, maybe 14 or 15 years old, throwing a ball around behind the stands, but I didn't know any of them. So I asked if they'd seen Tuda or Flit or Clarence. Look at what we got here, the tallest one said. What's your name? Joe. Y'all a boy or a girl? Another one asked. I think they were confused because my hair was too long for a boy, but I was dressed in hand-me-down clothes from my brothers, jeans, a baggy t-shirt, and sneakers. Plus, they'd never heard of a girl named Joe. Feel that hair, the first one said, touching my hair and rubbing it between his fingers. Well, I'm used to that by now because it happens a lot. Folks here have never touched a white person's hair before, and they're curious. I let my friends at school do it, but this time was different, and I got scared. I started to back up, thinking it was time to run, but I backed right into one of them. Hold on there, Whitey. Don't keep us guessing. Are y'all a boy or a girl? Before I could answer, the first boy pushed me down. I hit my head on the ground hard, but I was so scared that I barely felt it. Let's find out. Pull his pants down. Then one of them held my arms down while another unsnapped my pants. I kept thinking, this cannot be happening. I tried to yell out to the other kids milling about behind the stands, but my voice wouldn't work. So I just kept kicking and managed to get free before the boys could do anything else. Then I ran away from them as fast as I could, snapping up my pants while I ran. I didn't even realize I was bawling until I heard one of them calling after me, "Let the crybaby run back to Mommy and Daddy." I stood next to the stands, pretending to watch the game until I could breathe easy again. I kept looking around, thinking that everybody had seen and would be laughing at me, but nobody seemed to notice. I thought about telling Mom and Dad what had happened, but that would only make it worse. Just thinking about talking to them was too embarrassing. Well, for the next 2 years, this sort of thing kept happening to me. So on the one hand, I was having this incredible experience, but on the other hand, I was fairly routinely molested by some of the boys in town. And my parents didn't know what was happening. I couldn't talk about it. And that's kind of one of the overwhelming memories for me there. And at the end, it did get violent along those lines, and we ended up leaving town very, very abruptly. And basically, I never went back until I started working on this book. And I'd found a wonderful editor, and she said to me, "Joe, if you want to write an authentic, honest book, you have to go back to Mound Bayou and absorb the setting, see the people again, interview them." And I thought, I can't do that. I can't go back. My last experience there had been pretty awful. And I was also worried what I was going to find out about our having been there. Had we been accepted? Was my mother the loved teacher that I pictured, or was that kind of just a family story that had evolved and wasn't true? Was my father loved as a doctor, or were we just kind of marginally accepted as outsiders? So I didn't want to go back, and I resisted. And then I thought about it, and I said, well, my parents were really brave back in the 60s when they moved our family there, and I can be brave too. And so I did go back, and I interviewed people, including one of the boys that had attacked me, who was now a man in his 60s, and I had a chance to talk with him. And that experience of going back is the last chapter of the book. And it was truly remarkable, and I'm going to be going back again this coming week to do a reading, and I will be seeing everyone from the town again and getting together with old friends. So that gives you a little bit of the story of what's in the book, a little bit of the readings. And I want to share something about, in closing, what's been happening as a result of the book. So I started out to write something that was really my family's story, in particular my mother's story. And I loved her, and I was honoring her, and I respected her. She was my role model, and that's where I started with the book. And after I wrote it and it started circulating, I realized that from what people were saying to me, that they were hearing pieces of the civil rights movement and race relations that they hadn't really thought about. That it was kind of a ground level picture of what was going on. And as a result of that, I find myself in a position fairly often now to be asked, well, what do I think about today? Is it better? Has it changed? And given that a lot of thought. And what I hear often from people is, let's move on. We are a post-racial society. We have a biracial president. We've come so far since the 1960s. Let's stop talking about it and just live, and people need to take care of themselves. And I listen to that, and it's heartbreaking to me, because it is still very, very hard to grow up black in America. I firmly believe this. There are certainly individuals who have had wonderful experiences and been extremely successful, and it's fantastic. And we are a long way from where we were in the 1960s. But there is still a separation. There are still many, the majority of white people that do not have any black friends, and many black people that do not have any white friends. And when you don't know each other personally, there's this sense of other. And when there's an other, there's a lack of trust. And sometimes it bubbles over, this lack of trust, into terrible things. And we've been seeing that. It seems every month there's been something new with a police incident. So my hope is that by talking about this book, that I will help raise the awareness of racial issues today and personalize it. Because it is my personal story, and it's something I feel very passionate about, and I'm very grateful for the experience I had, and now I'm very grateful for the opportunity to share it with wonderful people like you folks. So that's what I had to say, and thank you so much for joining me for this.
Are you going to take questions?
I will take questions, yes. So, thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Joe, that was wonderful.
Thank you.
Your mother clearly was a very, very special person. But what I'm intrigued with is the mystery of your dad.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about him, coming from a successful practice in New England pediatrics and doing what he did, had against all the Puerto Rican and Hawaiian. He was able to rise above all that and do what he did. Can you tell us a little bit?
Sure. So my dad was a pretty amazing individual as well, and I would love to write about a book about him someday. He was, as I said, he had his pediatrics practice. When he got into his 40s and all the med school bills and everything he owed was all paid off, he started getting restless. He said, well, now it's routine. I'm doing the same thing every day. And he decided to go back to school and got a degree in public health. And while he was there, he was introduced to new programs that were starting up around the country to introduce clinics into the areas where the poorest people lived. And one of those was in Boston, where we lived. And he, in response to one of the doctors there coming to talk to all of the students and say, we need volunteers, he went to volunteer. And when he showed up, they realized they had not just a resident or a guy just starting out, but a guy in his mid-40s who'd run his own practice and was experienced. And they said, we'd love you to volunteer here at Columbia Point, but what we'd really like is for you to manage the clinic we're going to start in Mississippi. And he said yes, without even coming home to ask my mom, and thus the story about him telling us over lunch. He was, we called him Don Quixote. In fact, the second chapter in the book is called Living with Don Quixote, because there's positive and negative to being Don Quixote. He wanted to save the world, and I so admire him for that, and he was passionate about it. He really wanted to help. But as so often happens with someone heroic like that, the family pays the price of that heroism. And my father was no different. But he, from the time he was a teenager, he cared about people. My mother talked about what drew her to him in the first place when they met in high school. And they were in high school drama together. They were at rehearsals and they'd walk home afterwards. And one day, fairly early on in their friendship, he said, when I step off the curb in Boston, it matters across the world in China. That he believed we were all interconnected. Well, my sister recently, when I mentioned that, she said, I wonder how many girls he used that line on. But he was a dreamer right from the beginning, and I'm glad he was, because I'm a dreamer too. I like to think I'm like both my parents. But that was it.
I mean, could you continue with this story about your dad? With your dad and mom, what ultimately happened in terms of their marriage?
Okay, so they were high school sweethearts, or college sweethearts, I should say, high school platonic friends, and were married over 30 years. When we moved to Mississippi, there were real strains on the marriage as part of that, but they got past that, and they were real true partners again. And when we left Mississippi and moved to Miami, it looked like that partnership was going to keep going. To the outside world, they really seemed like a perfect couple and working together in a very important cause. But it did fall apart after that. So in their early 50s, my parents were divorced. My mother, after that, really came into her own. She'd already developed hugely as a result of the teaching. After the divorce, she realized how independent and strong she was. And her students became her life. And I don't know if that would have happened to the same extent. It certainly happened in Mississippi and here in Miami, but in LA, it just took off incredibly. My dad remarried, and he married a fellow pediatrician, and they were married for over 30 years. And I have two younger sisters from that marriage. And the woman he happened to marry, or the woman he married, happens to be black. And so my family is now a biracial family. And I love looking at the pictures of my son's wedding, where we have the extended family there. And I see these folks from very different worlds all together in one joyous picture. And I'm very grateful that that became a part of my life. So my parents both were happier afterwards, after separating. My mom lived with us for 25 years. And so I was very close to her. I don't know that I would have gotten to write this book if she hadn't lived with us. And they both were very good as they got older, very happy with their lives. So, thank you.
Yeah, I know you have a rather unvarnished style of storytelling, and there is a plantation in Mississippi which has been reconstructed, including the slave quarters, including the entire slave experience. And I was wondering whether, as part of your research, you may have visited that plantation.
I haven't, but I will. Now that I know it's there, I have heard of similar setups in North Carolina, tied in with the University of North Carolina there. Now that I know there's one in Mississippi, I will seek that out. I'm hoping, I go to Mississippi next week just for a couple of days, and I'm hoping to return in the fall and do a tour of the whole state, visiting folks and speaking about things. That would be fantastic. Thank you.
Did you have any girlfriends when you were living in Mississippi?
You know, I didn't. I was such a tomboy, and all my activities were very boyish. And I talked with one of my older brother's close girlfriends, a platonic girlfriend, a few years ago when I was working on the book. We were talking by phone. And I asked her what her experience had been specifically with the boys inappropriately touching me. And I said, was that your experience? Is that something all the girls went through? And I didn't have any girlfriends to talk about it with. And she said, no, I never had a problem with that, but my little sister did. And I said, well, what was the difference? And she said that she sent different signals, that she had been taught not to play with the boys. And because I was a tomboy and played with the boys, they thought this was okay. And you know, part of me said, this is a terrible answer to make, because it's not the little girl's problem. It's the little boy's problem, or the big boy's problem. But that was her take on it. So I didn't have girlfriends at the time, but this woman who was a little bit older than me and was my brother's friend, she and I became close enough to talk about stuff like that. But mostly it was the boys. And kind of a fun little side note on that, I had, in anticipation of going to Mississippi next week, I had been planning to call the mayor of town to say, I want to interview you and I'd like you to take me around town so I can see some things with a little bit more formal setting. And through an intermediary, someone who I knew had worked with the town, I said, can you just let him know I'm going to be calling, so it won't be a cold call, it'll be a warm call. And this intermediary sent me an email a couple hours later saying, the mayor remembers playing with you. So it turns out that he was the younger brother or the younger cousin of my closest friend. And I didn't know that, but as soon as he said that and I heard the name, I recognized it. So I called the mayor, and I'd been given his private cell phone number. So he didn't answer with anything formal, he just said hello. And I wasn't sure I had the right number, so I said, is this Mayor Johnson? And he said, yeah, this is the mayor. And I said, hey, Daryl, hi. And he said, Joe? And we talked for the next half hour about those times. And he said what he remembered was that I was always with this group of boys and that we built forts and tree houses. And that's actually when I went back and interviewed people, and I would say, what do you remember about my family? And the answer I got most often was, well, you were always in the trees. So apparently I lived in the tree houses that we built. But just a wonderful memory. Yeah.
You had said that you talked to the man that later on that attacked you or molested
Yes.
you. What was that like?
Well, I'm giving away the end of the book a little bit, so I hope you'll still all read it. But it was actually pretty amazing. I had the friend who was the older cousin of the mayor. I had called him and asked him to set up a series of interviews. And he said, well, sure, who do you want to talk to? And I said, my dad's colleagues and patients, my mother's fellow teachers and her students, our friends, that age group, and of the 4 boys that attacked me, if any of them are still around, I'd like to speak with them. And he called me back a few weeks later, and he'd lined up a whole bunch of interviews for me, but not with any of those guys. And I pointed that out to him, and I said, you know, what's up? Do they won't talk to me? And he said, well, no, I didn't ask. I couldn't believe you'd want to talk to them. I said, Clarence, I really do. I really want to talk with them. And he said, okay, but I don't know about this. He called me back a couple of hours later, and he'd reached one of them, who was actually the ringleader of the group, and he said, he wants to talk to you, and the reason he wants to talk to you is because he's wanted to apologize for years and years, and this is his opportunity. And we actually had a pretty amazing conversation, which is detailed in the last chapter, but it started and ended with a hug. So I was able to reach a closure that very few people who have been the victim of an attack are able to do. So it was, again, I had to gird myself up for that conversation, but I'm very glad I did, because it was very important. And I got to find out what had really happened, because my parents had been advised by one of the local leaders, by the local priest, that we had to leave town. That it wasn't just our deciding for our own safety to get out of town. It was a concern that if word got out that 4 black boys had molested and beaten a white girl, that the KKK would come in and burn the town down. Whether that was a real concern or not, again, we'll never know. But my parents believed it enough as a possibility that they said, for the safety of the town, we'll leave. So, yeah.
What was it that you seem so close with your parents in some ways that you didn't feel comfortable enough to tell them about these stories with the boys?
The question was, why didn't I feel comfortable talking with my parents when I sound like I was very close with them? I think there's a huge difference between talking about everything else and anything having to do with sex or sexual attack, that just made that so much more difficult. I think today as a society, we're much more open. I think if the same thing happened today, I probably would be able to talk with my parents. They probably would have gotten me counseling, gotten me talking about it. At the time, it was just swept under the rug.
So the last instance, when you had to leave, you had approached them, or someone else had approached them? That last incident where your family had to leave the town?
So when we had to leave, my father didn't want to leave. My mother was convinced by the priest that we should leave. My father came to me, and I will always appreciate that he did this. And he said to me, Joe, do you want to leave? And my answer was, I don't want to go back to school where everyone's going to know this happened. And he said, okay, we're leaving. So I don't know how much of it was that he believed that we were putting the town in danger, how much he thought that maybe this was going to be the first of many attacks, because there was a concern that it was my mother's work in the classroom that had maybe gotten the KKK to put pressure on the town to get us out. I mean, there were all these possibilities floating around, but my father asked me how I felt. So at 11 years old, I was able to tell him, no, I want to go.
How did you know to identify these boys?
They were towns kids. I knew them. One of them was the older brother of one of my very good friends. And I knew 2 of them by name. And the whole town knew who they were, and they were ostracized, because when we had to leave town, that was something that was really grieved by, especially the students. My father's patients certainly missed him, but it was my mother's students who were so upset that we left. So I guess we have time for one more question.
I was going to ask you, Joe, how long were you there? How many years?
2 years. So we showed up in August of 1967, and we left in April of '69. So we were really there for the height of the civil rights movement. Thank you so much. I very much appreciate what we're doing here.
Thank you, Joe. I noticed that between some of the passages, everybody was sort of sitting and not applauding, so I'm hoping that everybody was saving that up for one more round of applause for Joe. Thank you. Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Folks, we do have the book for sale behind the counters out here. Joe will be sitting right over here signing. For those of you watching online, give us a call. We'll get a book autographed and we'll ship it to you. Y'all join join the courtyard, have some drinks. We got a live music out there. Got a lot of good things going on at the bookstore tonight. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you.